Well, hi there. So in this video, we're going to take a look at Extra Practice Module 21. And this one is like fiscal and multipliers. So it's kind of putting together the ideas that we've been talking about a little bit. So fiscal policy plus the multipliers. Number one, check your understanding. Explain why a $500 million increase in government spending will generate a larger increase in GDP than $500 million in transfers. And this is a great question. It makes us kind of think about what's the difference between those. And that's the answer is it's true because the spending, right, is initially counted in GDP. And the transfers are not. So the idea here is that, when the government hands Mr. Glossinger a check, then that doesn't actually get counted in GDP. That if the government were to build a bridge for the equivalent amount, right, then that instantaneously gets added to GDP. And so then there's this multiplier effect, right, that we've kind of been talking about. And the multiplier effect like ripples out and causes all of this extra spending in the economy. So if they give me the check or if they build the bridge. But in the initial round, right, the initial action, the spending gets counted and that increases GDP, whereas the transfers don't. And so the transfers don't increase GDP quite as much as the spending does. Again, really just because the spending gets counted, but the transfers themselves do not until Mr. G spends the money. Number two, and this is the same idea why a tax cut. Number two says that. Explain why a $500 million reduction in spending will generate a larger decrease than a $500 million tax increase. And it's also true, this is the same idea, because the spending cut reduces GDP, while the tax cut or the tax increase doesn't, and it's not like implicitly part of GDP. It doesn't change GDP directly, maybe is the way we could say that, right? So it's basically the same idea. Like if they cut spending, then that actually reduces GDP. But if they raise taxes, that doesn't directly change GDP until it affects Mr. G, and then Mr. G cannot go buy things. And that's where the effect happens, right? So the initial effect in taxes and transfers doesn't change GDP. Number three, the country of Moldova, I don't know what that is, has no unemployment insurance benefits and a tax system using only lump sum taxes. They're telling us that so that we can kind of simplify the model. The neighboring country of Moldova, Moldova is a country, but Moldova is not, has generous unemployment benefits, tax system where they have to pay percentage of their income. Which country will experience greater variation in real GDP in response to demand shocks, both positive and negative? Explain. And so this is kind of getting you to think about all the purposes of like kind of the idea of unemployment benefits and a tax system that kind of responds to people's changes in incomes. What the effect of that is to kind of smooth out, right? When you have a recession, then in, Moldova, you'd start getting unemployment benefits, right? And your tax bill would go down when you lose your job. Whereas in Moldova, you don't have anything like that. And so when you lose your job, you immediately cut spending a lot. And so what we'd say is that in Moldova, that's the one without the stuff, recessions and expansions, by the way, because it's true of these as well, recessions and expansions would be kind of more severe than, what's the other one? Moldova. Such stupid names. They could have just used like actual countries. So, and because nothing to smooth them out. And the idea here again is that when you lose your job and you live in Moldova, you instantaneously get no change in your taxes, so you still have to pay your tax bill, and you get no unemployment benefits, and so you'll really shrink your consumption spending. Whereas in like Moldova, you get unemployment benefits when you lose your job, and your tax bill goes down, so you're not going to shrink your consumption spending quite as much during a recession. So it has the effect of making recessions less severe. Likewise, on an expansion side, it kind of smooths that out as well, because if you're getting paid a whole lot more and all that, your tax bill goes up in Moldova, so it kind of reduces your consumption automatically. This is the distinction between automatic stabilizers, right, and why they're useful. So if anybody ever tells you, the U.S. should have a flat tax and we should cut unemployment benefits and things like that. The consequence of that, one consequence, right, is that it would produce more severe recessions and more severe expansions, and that, much more volatile business cycle, and that's maybe less desirable for business planning purposes. Okay, let's take a look at some of these multiple choice questions. All right, multiple choice number one. First one says the MPC, all right, and then it's like a bunch of statements, has a negative relationship to the multiplier. So if you think about it here, right, like MPC, if the MPC plus the MPS equals 1. So let's say if we were 0.5 and 0.5, and the spending multiplier we know is 1 over the MPS. So I'm just kind of solving this problem here. So that would be then 2. But let's say the MPC then went up to 0.75 and the MPS therefore went to 0.25. So now the spending multiplier would be 1 over 0.25, which is 4. And so if the MPC goes up, right, the MPC goes up from MPC 0.5 to MPC 0.75, then we can see that the spending multiplier actually goes up. And that should make sense because the idea that like if you're consuming more, then the multiplier effect is greater because it's multiplied in the economy more. So we would say that a negative relationship is not true. One is not true. It is not equal to 1 in all cases. And in fact, it's quite rare for it to equal 1 because typically people save something. And then it says represents the proportion of consumers' disposable income that is spent. That's a fair explanation of it, right? It's the change, it's the proportion of when you get a change in your disposable income, it's what's the change in your consumption. So we'll say 3 only C. Number 2, assume that taxes and interest rates remain unchanged when government spending goes up and both savings and consumer spending increase when income increases. Okay, and that's kind of just telling us so that we know how this problem operates. The ultimate effect on real GDP of $100 million increase in spending will be, and if that's true, we know that there's a multiplier effect. In fact, the stuff before it tells us there's a multiplier. So we know that there should be an increase bigger than the 100 million. And so increase of more than 100 million, B. Okay, let's take a look at number 3. The presence of taxes has what effect on the multiplier? Well, it would kind of reduce the multiplier in the sense that, if you have more taxes, you have less consumption being created in the rest of the economy. So like this simple multiplier that we have here, spending is 1 over MPS equals 2. If you have basically some of this amount being dedicated towards taxes, then you're going to save less and you're going to consume less. And so the multiplier would be smaller, B. Number 4. A lump sum tax, right? And that's just one that you just pay a chunk. So it's not higher or lower as income increases. It's independent of your income. And it's definitely not the most common form of tax. And so that's one example where in economics, in the really simple, like kind of entry level economics, I don't want to say this is simple because this stuff is complicated, but in entry level econ, we have to use certain real simplifications that don't play out in the real world. And that's an example of one where a lot of these have to assume a lump sum tax. Which of the following is not an automatic stabilizer? Number 5. Income taxes, they are. Unemployment, insurance it is. Medicaid it is. Food stamps it is. Monetary policy is not automatic, right? Policymakers have to actually change that. And so the first 4 are automatic. They kick in regardless. So E is the right answer here. Let's take a look at free response number 2. It says a change in government spending results in a change in real GDP equal to 200. Assume the absence of taxes, trade, changes in aggregate price. Okay, well, you can't assume anything. All right, so nothing else is changing, ceteris paribus. Assume MPC is equal to 0.75. What's the size of the change in spending that resulted in the increase of 200? This is a great question. This will appear on the exam. So part A, so we know that the total change, right, is equal to 200. They give us that. And they're saying the government spending times the spending multiplier, right, equals 200. And what we're looking for is the question mark. How much was the government spending? And so we're given MPC of 0.75. So we know if MPC is 0.75, we know MPS is 0.25, and the spending multiplier equals 4, 1 over the MPS. And so 4 times something equals 200, so that must be 50. All right. Part B, so you will definitely be asked to do it on the test. And students screw it up all the time. So I'll tell you the mistake that they make, so you won't make it, is they take the 200 and they multiply it by 4 and they're like 800. And I'm like, no, multiplying by the initial change, right? The initial change. Anyways, now suppose the change in government purchases was 20 million. What value of the multiplier would result in an increase in real GDP of 200? So this one is saying we have 200 and it's 20 times something. So that would mean the spending multiplier equals 10. That's kind of a weird way to ask that. C, given the value of the multiplier you calculated in B, what's the marginal propensity to save that would have led to that value? So again, we're kind of just working backwards. So if we know spending multiplier is 1 over the MPS, then it's 1 over X equals 10. And so 0.1 is the right answer there. So the MPS is 0.1 in this case. I think that's it. Marginal propensity to save, right? So be very careful, because sometimes they'll say like, what's the marginal propensity to consume, in which case 0.1 would be wrong, right? So be careful with these. All right, what a great set of practice problems. I hope it helped you. See you next time.